networked freight procurement platform. Have known Nitin now for many years and have really enjoyed the way he is building a truly enterprise class SaaS company from India. And Nitin is based out of Chennai and Ashish is based out of Gurgaon. We'll move to Pushkar next. Pushkar is the founder and CEO of Let's Transport. Prior to Let's Transport, Pushkar worked with the food division of ITC, where he handled operations, product launches, and quality checks, and also oversaw some of their manufacturing facilities. And he holds a BTech and MTech degree from IIT Kharagpur. So just to give you a quick introduction to Let's Transport, they are building one of the largest platforms for end-to-end urban transportation solution for enterprises and truckers. Again, have known Pushkar for many years. I remember them starting on the last mile with trucking and have gradually expanded to other larger segments within the logistics space. And lastly, Raghuram Taluri. He is the co-founder and CEO of LoadShare. Raghu is, rather maybe to give Raghu's background first. Prior to LoadShare, Raghu was heading customer experience at Myntra. And before he was an associate partner at McKinsey & Company, based out of Dubai, and worked with McKinsey in India as well. And Raghu is a graduate of IIT Delhi and also did his MBA from IIM Lucknow. And again, to give a quick introduction to LoadShare, LoadShare actually started on the last mile logistics side, started from the Northeast, but then have gradually built more of an end-to-end platform for logistics, which is spread across the country. So as you can see, we have a panel today, which is a mixture of both investors, operating companies within logistics, and software companies catering to the logistics space, which creates a fairly diverse and rich panel today. So thank you, gentlemen, for giving your time and being here today. Before we start, I just wanted to add a quick note that to thank all the listeners of the audience who have joined today. We do recognize that these are testing times for most of you. And at the outset, I would say that I hope that everyone on this call, their families and their colleagues are safe and healthy wherever they are, in whichever part of the country or the globe that they are in at the moment. And I do recognize that COVID might be top of the mind for many of the listeners today, but I also believe that most of you would have been through many webinars in the last 2 to 3 months, which have been all about COVID, how you're tackling the situation. So we thought it'll be only probably apt not to focus just on COVID in today's webinar, and to take a stock of logistics industry at an overarching level. What makes actually logistics very interesting is that if you look at logistics as a percentage of GDP, I think different figures I'm sure all of you see, it's somewhere around 13 to 14% of GDP, which makes it a $300 to $400 billion industry, which is a massive industry in itself. But somewhere in the last 5 years, we have seen a creation of many startups in this space. And clearly the 3 founders that we have on today's call represent 3 companies in that space. And it's a good time if you look back at the last 5 years to take stock of this industry. So to start with, I'm actually going to begin with Ashish here first. As I mentioned, Innoven is an investor across many different companies in the logistics space. So Ashish will be very useful. Number one, and I did not attempt it myself because I didn't want to go wrong, will be useful, first of all, just for the audience to know which companies in logistics you guys have invested in, but also given the vantage point that you have, to also talk about what you think of as different segments and the structure of this industry, so that I think a lot of the comments and questions that we put later on can be put into perspective.
Okay, hi, Alok. So, I mean, we have invested, I would say, roughly 15 companies, mostly in India, a couple of them in China as well, including, I mean, I'll name a few. The last one we did was, in fact, Pushkar, Let's Transport. So that is, again, that we did a few months back. Then we have invested in some of the larger platforms, Intercity, Blackbuck, Rivigo, different models. On the express side, Express Bs. Then in the intracity or the last mile space, apart from Let's Transport, Porter, which is slightly different business, which is more SME focused, on demand. We've done Elastic Run, Shadowfax, which is a bit more hyper local delivery. Interestingly, we have also done, bulk of the startups are in the surface transport road area. We have done one which is called Kogo Boat. That company primarily focuses on the export-import EXIM business. So more shippers, that's more catered to with the shipping lines and all. Then this is largely a 3PL segment. We also have a portfolio company called ShipRocket, which you could define as 4PL, which is essentially kind of aggregator, a multi-carrier aggregator for some of the new age brands and some of the SMEs. So I mean fairly widespread portfolio. Now in terms of the industry structure, I think the most traditional way people slice and dice the industry would be one would be the long haul, which is the intercity. So if you got to ship something from Mumbai to, let's say, Delhi, so that is one segment. Then within intracity or the last mile or the first mile, I mean, you will have players like, Pushkar and Raghu, Porter. So that's, I think, how the industry is now. We also look at, full truckload and, less than truckload. So eventually for large shippers, typically who have a lot of volume, they would contract for full truckload. While, in some cases, smaller players or even in some cases, even e-com parcels, those would get into partial truckload. So I think that's generally how the industry is looked at today. And we are focused largely on, I would say, surface transport today. So we are not covering, warehousing and a bunch of other things that are also part of this overall industry, air freight and ocean freight and things like that.
Got it. No, this is super helpful. And Ashish, if you permit, I'm actually going to add one more part of the structure to this industry, which is the distinction between consumer loads versus B2B loads, which sometimes I find helpful also because a lot of the companies, they're delivering small packages all the way in the last mile to consumers' home. Whereas there is a different segment which might be delivering, let's say, PNG stuff from a distributor to a retailer, which is a more classical B2B load. So no, that's actually very helpful. And Nitin, of course, sees this picture from a different vantage point because Nitin works with enterprises who use logistics, whether it's CPG, industrials, etc. I hope that's a correct representation, Nitin. Will be actually helpful, Nitin, if you were to give a one-liner on what the company does.
Sure. In some sense, Alok, I think the way we look at the industry is not, as Ashish said, the traditional lines of long haul, mid mile, last mile, and so on. We look at it as a network, and the belief is that in the B2B load segment that you pointed out too, most industries would start looking at their, from manufacturing to the end consumer as a network rather than as multiple linear segments of transportation. And
Right.
so when they start looking at that ecosystem as a network, it becomes important to have technology to manage that network, where
Right.
we pretty much sit on the other end of the value chain of, let's say, Raghu and Pushkar, where Raghu and Pushkar, go to a CPG company and are transport service providers to them. Like them, there are, 100 other companies that essentially in different legs, whether it is export, import, or domestic freight, they service large companies like Unilever, Britannia, ITC, etc. Pando essentially, looks across all of these transporters and multiple legs to essentially look at the overall ecosystem as a network and help optimize and rationalize that spend at a network level.
Got it. Got it. Fantastic. Fantastic. I actually want to move on to both Pushkar and Raghu and would maybe go in that sequence to answer the same question. And I do apologize in advance if my question is going to sound just a touch skeptical, though that is not my intent. But if you look at the last 5 years, we have seen emergence of what we are calling the tech logistics or tech-driven logistics, right? And lots of startups have come into the space over this time. But usually when you look at, companies, you can divide them into two pieces when we think about use of technology. I could argue that even an oil refinery uses technology, right? Because they might be using an ERP system, which might be production planning or something else. So in that sense, yes, everybody uses technology. But when you think about tech-driven logistics, one is making an assumption that technology is actually very core to what you do, as opposed to, if I may say, some age-old logistics company which are not classified into tech logistics. So if we go into your businesses, I would actually just love to hear just one example of where technology is making a difference to the core, and which is why this tech logistics is actually very different than what traditional logistic companies did.
Absolutely.
Maybe we'll begin with you, Pushkar. Go ahead.
Okay. A very relevant question, Alok, and thank you for the introduction. I think you've rightly mentioned ERP in an oil refinery is also technology, and I feel most of the businesses are technology enabled. But when you ask what or how technology derives, meaningful insights, is we have a network of 60 to 70,000 individual small truck owners, and what we've done is we've empowered them with an application. Now that application is their gateway into what can be done for them, right? The reason why we're very close to an enterprise is the fact that think of an individual driver owner trying to work with an enterprise, right? He has to go through the process of contracting, RFPs, RFQs, collections, invoicing, so on and so forth. And this in itself in India is such a complicated process that they're fairly stuck with one enterprises probably 5 or 10 years ago. Today, you download an app, you just click on a transaction, and you have an access to more than 250 enterprises that we work with, right? At the same time, what you've done is you've democratized that entire piece of working for all your individual drivers out there. There are about 5 million of them, and you can empower them. They just have to download an app there right through with 250 enterprises. Everything else is taken care by us, right? Interestingly, what a lot of people think is that logistics is a cost plus business, right? It isn't. There is an opportunity cost for every individual driver owner out there, which is what allows them to offer a better take rate to platforms, which creates more value to them. This from an ERP is difficult, right? An ERP might orchestrate a lot of things. For instance, an example, what Nitin pointed out was, Nitin might be able to tell what is needed, right? A Google map might be able to tell you that this is the most optimized route to go. But if you do not have a cab who has an Ola or an Uber app, you can't go there. And that's the difference between the two business models that we're talking about.
Interesting. Raghu, would love your take on this as well. Raghu, I think you're probably on mute. So
sorry, if we say technology is an enabler versus core, I think the core thing comes by two things. One, can technology actually help us kind of create a much larger scale, which would not be perhaps possible on paper or on Excel sheets? And the second one is, can technology actually help us create a fundamentally different business model, right? Which otherwise would not have been unlocked by just putting more people on the job or more manual work, right? I'll give an example of both. I think one, from a scalability, I think there'll be many logistics companies that are of some scale. But I think for one to become truly large, I think technology is at core, right? You can run a logistics company doing whatever kind of logistics at a subscale without technology. But after a point of time, the technology becomes so core that you need to have it. So in our own example, we have branches in far-flung areas of India, right? So going all the way up to Dimapur, Kohima in Northeast, to smaller places in Bihar. And the way we are able to manage that scale is just through technology, which is a hardwired way of doing things, right? If we don't have that, the cost of communication, the cost of overhead in terms of managing all these operations, the number of people that you put in will naturally limit the scale of what a company like us can become, or I would argue for that matter, for any company to become, right? So I think it is scale enabler, and that makes it core. The other example of being core to a business model is, let's take an example of a delivery boy. Now he's working with doing some deliveries for a Flipkart, right?
Yeah.
Now there's an opportunity where he could also be doing deliveries for a Swiggy. Now, how does he know what to do? And how does the client get to know what has been delivered, what has not been delivered? And how does somebody kind of orchestrate this, right? It is something that can be done only through technology. You can, yes, if you have 10 delivery boys, then you can have, one person who's kind of figuring out where they are, what they're doing at what point of time by calling them and kind of coordinating. But imagine that to be like 5,000 delivery boys. You just can't do it, right? So I think that's a place where now technology creates a new business model by which you can actually combine across various different asset classes or different client segments and create a model that is kind of that much more efficient and that much more powerful, right? So there's a couple of examples just to indicate how technology is becoming more and more core.
No,
Fantastic.
just a quick interjection there. I think the for something to be core or non-core, I think, let's say you take Flipkart to be a technology business, right? Or e-commerce in general as an industry to be a technology business. It's either where your buyers or your sellers, either your demand or your supply, you're able to empower through technology, right? Either, and to Raghu's point of growth or to Pushkar's point of sort of getting access to the supply side, right? If either your demand or your supply side advantage came through technology, and without that technology you are not able to get that advantage, that I would consider as core, right? I think more often than not we end up talking about tech logistics companies, right? Because traditionally the difference between a traditional logistics company that would use an ERP, and they did, if you take PCI in India or Safe Express or Gati and guys like that, I think everybody is using an ERP to sort of drive efficiencies in their operations, right? The difference between them and sort of new age startups driving this is that either their customer advantage or their supplier advantage is coming through technology, and that's what makes it core in my
opinion. No, point well taken. Point very well taken. I wanted to add a note for all the listeners, which is that of course there'll be a monologue of questions from my side, but please do feel free to add your questions to the Q&A tab. And I do promise that we will leave a sufficient amount of time towards the latter part of this conversation to actually ask questions from there. And of course, if you don't ask, I will still ask. I have lots of questions for these guys, but it'll be great if you type your questions there, and I'll pick those up as well. Ashish, I want to come back to you again to get an investor perspective. And yes, there is a lot of difference between tech-driven logistics versus the examples that Nitin was talking about in terms of the old age companies here. That being said, at least as a layman, I would say that when you think about logistics, even though Pushkar believes differently, I still find logistics to be a very cost-driven industry, right? You are going to Flipkart or Amazon to negotiate on price, negotiate or to get a contract. Price still becomes a paramount thing. And I'm just taking Amazon and Flipkart as an example. You could replace that with any other potential customer. Very auction-driven pricing. Some of the larger players in the industry who are the I guess the biggest customers, they do have a lot of leverage in this process. This is also an industry that requires a lot of working capital. And therefore, as an investor, when you are investing in this, and you have clearly invested in many, what do you find to be very exciting about this industry from an investment perspective? And would also love to get your thought that as you have seen these journeys, how has the pricing margins and the working capital in this industry have evolved? And what have been the positive surprises post-investing and what negative surprises post-investing therefore?
I think, from an investor standpoint, I mean, logistics, if you are a very early stage VC, you probably don't mind having a lot of type 1 error, right? False positives. That's the way the nature is. Right. In a venture debt world, typically we try to reduce type 1 error, though obviously we want to participate in the upside as well. Logistics as an industry, it's not very binary in nature. So if you look at, this is not like somebody is trying to be a market maker, creating changing habits. This industry, the revenue pool, everything is out there. Right. So frankly, it's a question of the new age players, coming in and taking their share of that business. Now, obviously, within e-commerce, you could argue e-commerce still is where you can get significant alpha over and above the normalized GDP rate, which is where the center of gravity is for a lot of the logistics players as well. Right. So overall, for us, the market size, as you rightly said, whether it's 13 to 15% of GDP, is a large market. Right. I think the risk return, works for us because these are not binary businesses. Generally, it's not a fad. There is something real on the ground. The third thing is clearly, the fragmented nature of the industry and the tons and tons of data that is out there.
Yeah.
I mean, one would like to believe, and we are seeing early traction on that, that using data, technology, AI, I mean, whether it's demand supply matching, whether it is, how to drive better, efficiency. So eventually it is going to come down to efficiency. And I feel like, in the long term, number
Right.
one, the industry is going to get more consolidated. So the fragmentation will reduce. And number two is, I think, if you look from a shipper standpoint,
Yeah.
as more and more shippers are looking to working with lesser number of players who are fully integrated with them, who can provide them, what is today table stakes, right, around delivery times and turnaround times and visibility into where the vehicles are. So net, I mean, large industry, lot of data, a lot of scope for technology as an enabler to improve efficiency.
Right.
That is what kind of attracted us. Now, in terms of positive and negative, I would say, I mean, clearly on the e-commerce side, we believe, I think there is a lot of, runway for companies to grow. I think even before COVID, we were seeing that. And after COVID, I think, you will see an accelerated growth of e-commerce across all categories.
Right.
I would say, I wouldn't call it a negative surprise, but one thing you have to keep in mind is, I mean, the margin structure is still, I would say, not great today. I mean, if I look at some of the more, mature players, let's say in China, US, I mean, gross margins of, north of 20%, you would find with some of the category leaders.
That's right.
In India, depending on what your strategy is, how much money you have raised, and growth versus profitability, you would find gross margins ranging from 0% to maybe, high single digits generally. And I'm talking about gross margins where you actually liquidate all variable costs and not just what you pay to the, transporters.
Right.
So the margin structure, I think, will improve, but still it's pretty low. And as you said, I think the working capital cycle is very intensive because, see, this is a two-sided platform largely, right? Most of them are platform businesses. So to deliver a compelling value prop, I mean, you got to basically on the shipper side, there is always, focus on, apart from meeting all the SLAs on pricing. And on the transporter side, I mean, the truck owners, etc. I mean, one of the value props is you are going to be paying them, if not, daily, weekly, or, fortnightly. So, I mean, that part has to be very well managed through, both debt, because there is some part of equity that definitely gets sucked into working capital. But overall, I mean, if I look at it, I mean, this is still very early. And I feel there's a lot of runway for growth, for most of the new age players.
Interesting. I actually do have a follow-up question. And I'm actually going to divide that again. I know that Raghu and Pushkar, both of you, have a really operating logistics company, and Nitin is seeing a different side. But maybe to begin with this time, or with Raghu and Pushkar, Ashish talked about the fact that if you look at logistics companies outside India, we have seen margins which are north of 20%. And I remember I have read a lot of report, particularly on China, where I see those kind of margins there in the industry, right? Whereas if you look at the gross margins in India, they have been relatively harder to achieve.
Absolutely.
Right? Is it something structural about India which is making it this way, or do you think it is just the stage of evolution of the industry and it's just a matter of time? Whichever you want to go first, I'll actually.
Raghu, do you want to go first?
I think it depends on which segment of logistics do you play, how commoditized is it already, and which is the one where you have a differentiated proposition, either in terms of a value proposition of what you can do better than anybody else,
right,
or in which areas do you operate in, which are pain points and you are able to solve it better, right? So I think it's not a clear answer, but I would say that in general, given the nature of how not just logistics, but many other sectors are in India, right. I think there are some structural challenges to India, and particularly if you look at how things are from a maturity angle. But I just don't see that, if you go to a setup at a macro industry level, right, where you do a 5 years out, will it be that logistics becomes a high gross margin business? I don't think that's ever going to be the case, right? Within that, if you take companies and based on what their strategies are, what their models are, which areas they're operating in, is there an opportunity for a few companies to actually create good gross margin profiles? I think absolutely the answer to that is a is a clear yes. And I think we do see some signs as we evolve and as many of our geographies in our own experience mature, we do see that there's a good line of sight in some segments. And in some segments, we just see that the nature of the industry is there's so much legacy and there's so much of fragmentation already, and there's so much of existing players that you will never be able to, in the next 2-3 years, reach a position where you can say you can think of a 20% gross margin.
Right. Got it.
Alok, I would beg to differ on your point. When I said cost plus industry, and you said, there's always a cost pressure. The truth of this industry is that in India, your operating costs are fairly high. So if you do a per ton per kilometer rate and you do it with another country, we are operating at a much higher level, right? So if let's say in the US, someone spends about $1, they would spend about $1.50 to $2 in India to do a similar kind of a transaction.
And why is that so?
I'll come to it. Now, given that in play, I think all three of us, Raghu, Nitin, and myself, we are in the business of lowering it down for companies. We're not in the business of moving it from $1.50 to $2 per ton per kilometer, right? So yes, we want to create that efficiency for our client. To answer your question, where are these inefficiencies hidden? I think there are a bunch of places. When you look at probably my business or my industry vertical, I think it is to do with the fragmentation nature, right? You would never think of TCI, Gati, VRL operating in last mile space. Right. I mean, these guys are fairly large domestic players, businesses in the intercity space, wherein you're an expert in return loads. You can probably ply a truck between Delhi and Bangalore, but you're not folks who do deliveries in and around Bangalore or Delhi. The first reason to it is your cost to serve is fairly high, right? So from a business standpoint, when I place a truck between Delhi and Bangalore, I probably make a net margin of 5,000 rupees. In the last mile, it's about 50 rupees. Now, to manage a driver is the biggest pain point. Every businesses would be inclined to have or run intercity rather than run an intracity business, right? Which is why out of these 5 million trucks that I'm talking about, 95% of them are owned by driver themselves.
Yeah.
And you can't explore or think of efficiency coming out from them, which is why you'll have to empower them with technology, which helps you sweat your assets more and leverage variabilities across industries much more. I mean, we've saved north of 25% for great corporates. We go out there and probably position, this is how you can save your expenses. But the truth of the industry is, yes, we operate on a high per ton kilometer in India as such.
I would like to get a perspective from Nitin on this because Nitin, you sit on a slightly different side.
Yes.
You are working with enterprises where they are making selection for providers for their logistics needs as well. And therefore, in some ways, you're sitting on the buyer side of logistics as opposed to the provider side of logistics.
Not in some ways, in all ways.
In all ways. Okay, sorry, my bad. So therefore, given that vantage point, do you believe that structurally India will deliver lower margins than the example that Ashish talked about, or that's not necessarily true?
I actually, I'll start with a statistic, right? I think every supply chain manager, head of supply chain of a company that spends north of 80 to 100 crores in freight a year, you talk to and you go tell him, I can bring down your freight cost.
Yeah.
And you're not a transporter, right? You are a technology provider. You go tell him, I can bring down your freight cost. He would laugh you off and say, I have the least freight cost per kilometer in the industry. Every one of them, from Coca-Cola to Britannia to a 500 crore company, in a company that spends about 500 crores in freight across the board, right? And interestingly, earlier I used to think, how is that possible, right? Everybody's got the lowest numbers, it doesn't add up. Interestingly, we've actually seen less than 1 to 1.5% variance in a rupees per ton kilometer basis across all of these guys. Everybody's beaten down the transporters to the gut, right? Pushkar, seems to say that we're operating at a higher number and that he has a lot of leeway to come down. But if you talk to most transporters, they would absolutely not agree, right? They would say, and I don't know if Raghu does, but of course there are inefficiencies that you can squeeze in the ecosystem. I'm saying forget the fragmentation. Even if you were the size of a Gati or a TCI, and a lot of them actually now have started operating in the last mile segment as well, right? They've started doing last mile intracity deliveries, etc. as well. Their point of view is that the margin is extremely tight because the top line is extremely tight per kilometer, per ton kilometer, right?
Yeah.
One thing that Pushkar said, I think is very true, which is that, we are all three of us are in the business of bringing down that cost even further, right? The question is, what those pockets of value addition are, right? And I look at it from two perspectives, Alok. One, if it were not a cost center, right? And I've said, and we've been on panels where I've said it's a value center, not a cost center, it's a profit center, etc. as well, right? Whatever center it ends up being, ultimately, even in Europe and North America or in China, there is a standard RFP, RFQ reverse auction that goes on for freight procurement in 9 out of 10 cases, right? And if you are not in a commodity business, that would not happen. People don't run an RFP or a reverse auction to buy Pando because we're not in the commodity business. On the other hand, they use Pando to buy freight in an RFP, RFQ, reverse auction kind of ecosystem, right? So I think it is, whether we like it or not, it is a cost center, one. And two, I think the cost margin profile in India is low. But that said, I think it is because the focus has consistently been on the outside. If you talk to supply chain managers, they're constantly saying, what is the easiest way? They talk about productivity gains, right? Which basically is last year to this year, adjusted for inflation and a bunch of other things. How much am I able to additionally save? The boss has put a 5% number on it, and I will beat down my transporters to get that number. Right? This has been happening for like decades ago, right? So we're pretty much at that rock bottom in some sense. Now, interestingly, the change that we're seeing is to say, boss, my transporter is basically saying, I won't reduce a rupee more. I'm okay to let go of the business, right? Because I've hit rock bottom with this one more rupee and I'm willing to walk away, right? And year on year, that 5% productivity number, they're not able to hit. And so they're saying, okay, what else can I do which will allow me to then not even negotiate with the transporter? Why even give him 3 rupees more per kilometer and still be able to hit my 5 to 7% productivity number, right? And that is where I think the point of fragmentation or consolidation, network play, etc. are coming about. One. Two, I think channel really matters, right? E-commerce, the reason it is a high margin business for most logistics companies, the reason Ashish says, the gravity for most logistics companies is still in the e-commerce space is because they have only one channel, e-commerce. But if you talk to a Unilever, e-commerce is one of many channels for them. And so if you look at the e-commerce delivery channel for Unilever, it would actually be a high margin profile for them, right? Versus if you look at the regular, the Kirana store delivery, right? A multi-tiered supply chain, which is 90% of what Indian, ecosystem runs on. It is a multi-tiered ecosystem. So I think the margin profile change will not necessarily happen because of consolidation or scale or volume. It will actually happen because there is going to be a slow shift from general trade to modern trade. And when that shift from general trade to modern trade and e-commerce happens, you'll actually see the fundamentals of this actually changing. And therefore, I think last point to that is that, move from PTL to FTL, right? Where you actually have the part truckloads actually being sent out. In the last mile space, for instance, you'd actually see in the long haul space, rupees per ton kilometer be very low. Vis-a-vis in the last mile space, rupees per ton kilometer being higher, right? And however, in the last mile space, lots of smaller packages going vis-a-vis more consolidated packages in the long haul. You'd see that profile changing in the next 10 years, right? You'd see more and more companies willing to collaborate. One of the benefits that a platform like Pando offers is that a Johnson & Johnson, a Unilever and a Britannia are now saying, I'm willing to collaborate and pool my freight demand and give that to a Raghu or to a Pushkar to say, hey, you've got, you earlier had 100 crores, now you have 500 crores and go deliver on that, right? That gives benefits on both sides.
I think you'd like to interrupt, Alok.
Yeah, sure.
That Nitin has established is if we were to go and say we are 5% cheaper in the market, we would have enough and more demand our way.
Yeah.
Right? Yes, absolutely. So it's a point which I wanted to kind of, portray it as well. If you look at the way traditional RFPs have been working, right? I mean, think of them as a small transporter owning 10 trucks, trying to place some trucks for a Unilever, so on and so forth. When you own trucks, you actually buy a certain size of truck. Now, chances are I wouldn't need that kind of capacity on a particular day, which all of that seasonality, Diwali season, freight hikes, everything gets built into an RFP. When you talk to an aggregator on any lane, any capacity, I can do an entire matrix for you. So the day when a normal traditional transporter would have sent out a 5-ton truck, I'm willing to send a 3.5-ton truck, but take a premium on that. Which is where those efficiencies come from.
I think the message that at least I took away is that Pushkar and Raghu should try to shut down Pando sometime because he's the one responsible for getting these reverse auctions done.
I actually think Pando is a necessary evil in this industry. You help them communicate the right things to a client.
Pushkar, I'm going to focus on the word evil. I don't know about the necessary part, but the evil part is what I took away from this discussion.
Right.
Got it. Got it. I want to actually move on to a slightly different question, which is now I'm actually coming back to COVID a little bit here. If you look at the last 2-3 months, of course, we have all been reading a lot of stuff, and there is no dearth of what's coming out in the system. And most people are talking about a new world. There is, as if offices, real estate is dead because people are working from home. That's a new reality. Schools are dead. Remote education is a new reality. Remote health. There are lots of these sort of that we have entered a new world kind of phenomena that's going around at the moment. So Ashish, I mean, again, would you imagine that if we take logistics now as space, are we sort of coming to a completely new world in logistics? Or do you believe that as far as logistics is concerned, it is still, I guess, where we were, maybe with some modifications? And if so, what are those modifications?
And so I feel like it's, to use your words, more of the same with the few, boosters in certain segments. So
Right.
clearly, I mean, if you look at certain sectors, whether it's EdTech or health tech or OTT,
Right.
hyperlocal grocery delivery, for
Right.
them, clearly COVID is a bit like, what demonetization did for payments, right?
Right.
Both in terms of new customers and changing habits. As far as logistics is concerned, I mean, overall, logistics is a derivative of the overall economy, commerce, things that move around.
Right.
So, I mean, that is not going to change with COVID. In fact, you could argue that there is a short to medium term disruption. And, eventually, most companies, I have spoken with a lot of founders here. I spoke with, even the China team to look at what's happening there. I think most companies have started to come back to, 70, 80, 90% levels. I think, however, so when I look at if you were to again kind of, slice and dice, in the long haul business, I don't expect there would be much of a change. I think to some extent that would move with the rate of, the GDP. Now there could be some winners and losers as
Right.
the case is. I think you will see in the last mile, which is obviously a lot more focused on deliveries on the B2C side. I think that will go up because eventually, I mean, e-commerce clearly has a lot of tailwinds. In addition to that, even a lot of the traditional, retailers and folks who, really didn't think as this being core.
Right.
Almost everybody is kind of now, looking at this as, a core part of their distribution channel. So if you happen to be in the, kind of the last mile B2C space,
Right.
I think overall volumes will go up, and I think the pricing power might be slightly higher because at least for a medium period of time, there might be some supply demand gap. Before equilibrium comes in, I think there might be some benefits to companies like Pando, who are largely enterprise SaaS, helping shippers to optimize. And but overall, I don't believe this is going to be like kind of a demonetization moment for payments. So that's my take.
Raghu, would love sort of your thoughts on this as well. I mean, to what Ashish said, that because you are dealing with customers day in, day out, right? And over the last 3 months, lots of lockdowns, etc. as well. Are you seeing certain tailwinds? Are you seeing these as headwinds? How would you take both the short term and the longer term view of this?
Yeah, so I think in the immediate term, we saw, a lot of guys, a lot of the customers face trouble with their existing incumbent logistics service providers, and these are all the mostly smaller guys. And therefore, there was a need for people to come in and say, provide me an immediate solution. And in many ways, I don't even care about the cost, right? So it was that kind of scenario. To now, the existing incumbent supply or logistics service providers are coming back. So to that extent, there is normalcy coming in. I think the overall business itself is low. I think there's a faster recovery than expected, but I think we're still at an 80%. And the road to getting to 100% is going to be fairly long, in which case there is going to be some amount of overcapacity, right? And there are going to be, the cost pressures, etc., will continue to be there. E-commerce has taken off. Agree with that. I think one fundamental shift that I think is happening, and it's not very pronounced, but is going to come up, is the whole secondary logistics and the role of the distributor. I think that is going to get shaken a little bit, and we are seeing some discussions around this more than what used to happen earlier. So let's just maybe play out the chain, right? So the retail the retail stores which have been offered credit by the distributor, there are bad debts that the distributors are incurring. Therefore, they don't have as much credit to offer anymore in the market, and which means they also are now reducing the amount of, or at least the amount that they're purchasing from the brands, and they're saying, hey, look, I want smaller lots, but in more frequent and increase the frequency, right?
Yeah.
So that I think is a kind of change that now changes the way there is going to be more secondary part loads that are going to happen than before, and companies are going to collaborate to make that happen in a better manner. So that's one fundamental change, and therefore the whole last mile distribution on the B2B side, there are going to be changes compared to what used to be a much more well-oiled machinery, because this was all being done by the distributor or being highly influenced by the distributor. Now companies are getting in more actively to say, hey, look, I have solved the primary logistics problem, and the secondary logistics and the tertiary logistics, which is from the distributed retail, is actually what has been, what has let me down during this period, and I'm therefore more wary of it. And I want to rethink this, and I want to rethink this by getting some organized players who are more reliable, who can create cost efficiencies by combining across various different clients rather than just being dependent on me.
That's a very interesting thing. And Nitin, sorry, because I know that you have a lot of clients in the CPG space or FMCG space. Are you seeing anything similar to what Raghu is talking about?
100%. I think back to my earlier point of saying, I think I think the biggest change in logistics will come from the underlying changes in go-to-market for these companies. Right? And so if there is a change in the traditional modern trade, the channels that go to market, then that will in turn inspire a large change in logistics, because those are the beta there is very high. Right. So we're actually, three very large CPG clients of ours are actually looking at how secondary can be completely rethought. One.
Wow.
Two, out of them, two of them are actually actively collaborating to see if they can move from part truckloads to full truckloads, because earlier, part truckload inherently means higher unit costs, right? Per unit costs are higher. So how do I, while my demand is actually, order quantities are going down. There are no concept of, permanent dispatch plans, and minimum order quantities are no longer, being relevant. And so while retail or the distribution network is ordering in lower quantities, how do I still reduce my overall freight cost? Those innovations are coming in. Thirdly, I think in terms of technology penetration, it could be, ERP penetration, Alok, or, any kind of track and trace, or any even basic sort of technology, right? The penetration was very high in the long haul space, vis-a-vis the last mile space, because in the CPG or any of the traditional enterprise segment, that's the primary versus secondary sort of ecosystem, right? That Raghu was talking about. So I think people are also now saying, hey, I need more control in the secondary piece, right? I want, and that means not just looking for more trustworthy partners in the secondary piece, but also looking for technology, because really, all of logistics is, even our whole conversation around primary, secondary, etc., is all, based on the assumption that the metric I'm playing with is a Delhi to Chennai 15-ton truck. What is the cost for that, right? Now, and that's how contracts were made, and that's how, transporters built their volume in that lane. So that lane truck type transporter, that tag is the commodity on which everybody is playing, right? What is interestingly happening now is companies are saying, is there specific locations where I can go direct to retail from my factories or warehouses, right?
Understand.
And so on. Therefore, they don't have the concept of sort of traditionally saying Delhi to Chennai, I will constantly be doing a long haul. Right, and that we're actually seeing a fundamental shift in, where we're also working with a number of transport partners to sort of, in some sense, aggregate them and provide their solutions to the shippers as a consolidated solution as well. So completely agree with Raghu.
Understand. Actually, last question on COVID, and since I said at the beginning of the discussion that COVID is not going to be our focus of discussion, but Pushkar, I mean, would love to also know that what are the positives of COVID that you are seeing actually on logistics space at large, or particularly in your business?
I think, Alok, more philosophical answer, but I think all of us, including us and the clients, are becoming more transparent and equitable with frontline workers. We have shied away from, a lot of otherwise we should have taken responsibilities. And I think A couple of steps such as COVID insurances, masks, something that we took early on helped us build that trust within our supply base. And when a lot of people were facing a crunch for supplies, they actually returned back to find more work to kind of do those deliveries which we were getting when we were seated comfortably in home. I think that's a fundamental shift of how people are operating. I also think, like Raghu and Nitin, that it has accelerated probably technology adoption by at least a year or two. I mean, all of our bills were cleared online. Everything completely was digital for the last 3 months, and it was a fact that we could live our lives this way as well. I think a lot of reliance on the fact that technology is what brings in a lot of optimization as well as cost reduction. More importantly, so what I did see was a lot of traditional brick and mortar, either retailers or CPG companies, innovating very fast. The fact I come from a manufacturing background, to
Right.
change production lines from a SKU to an sanitizer, so on and so forth, that's unthought of, right? Unheard of. It would have probably taken 6 months if a sanitizer
Right.
were to be launched in pre-COVID days. I think that agility is something which I'm looking forward to. We signed up about 30 odd clients where we were
Right.
trying to leverage our learnings of direct to consumer deliveries. And most of them, wanted to do pilot right away. Now, it could also be that they were forced into, or probably arm twisted into it. But the fact that they were very open to innovation, I think that as a change is something which is here to stay.
I'll pick on one point that Pushkar made and Ashish to you here, which is that as COVID started right since the end of March, there has been a lot of labor disruption in the country. I mean, we keep seeing these images of people at the Delhi Ghaziabad border, and I guess at different places now across the country, there has been so much disruption. If you look at these labor movements, labor shortages, and I think also the focus on the people that Pushkar was talking about, given your expanse across so many investments, are you seeing anything fundamentally change in the way people are actually working with people at truly that last step of the food chain? Whether it's drivers or whatever, I mean, people who are really at that last mile effectively.
I think, I mean, again, anecdotal based on what I've heard from founders and a few traditional guys. I think what Pushkar said, I mean, I think generally while everybody talks about, partners, I mean, drivers are
Right.
partners, and I think almost every startup has tried to do more than what, they are used to getting from a traditional kind of industry, largely fragmented industry. So I think this is humanized, the driver lot. Plus, I mean, given that there has been paucity of drivers,
Right.
I think sometimes when the business is running like tic-tac-toe, whether you are a shipper or whether you are a platform, I mean, you probably don't pay as much attention in this kind of a situation where, there are people who are not available. I mean, in the, intercity long haul, there were cases when, thousands and thousands of trucks were, stalled at Chungis and,
Yep.
interstate borders, and there were drivers who, in fact, who couldn't get food and water, and they just left the truck and left. So I think I would say almost everybody, not only on the startup side, I think people appreciated what some of the drivers and all of the other people who are involved, whether it could be even in the warehouses, the loaders and unloaders and all of that, right? So I think there's been a lot more focus, and I think companies are trying to make sure that they do their bit to make not only their working conditions safe, but also to pay a little extra attention to them than what might have been pre-COVID.
No, that's a good point, and I hope that we see some permanent changes on this side, hopefully. I want to move on. And Raghu, I think at one point in the discussion, Ashish talked about the fact that, and I think Nitin touched upon it too, which is that the larger entities like Amazon, Flipkart, etc., have been some of the larger customers for many of the new age logistics players, including yourself. The reality, though, is that these folks also have very large captives of their own. Would and I'm assuming, therefore, working with them is a very fine balance in some ways because they are customers and therefore they are partners, but they're in some ways also competitors because they have their own logistics team as well. How do you balance this competition versus customer kind of dynamics with these kinds of players, and particularly because of the amount of buying power that they have?
So it's very simple, and there are fundamental changes happening here as well. I think,
Right.
first of all, we don't think of ever an angle that they are not customers, right? So they are customers. And by the way, when we work with them, we work directly with their logistics arm itself, right? So in that sense, there is no question of us kind of thinking of whether we are working with the logistics arm and therefore are we working with the enemy or are we working with the customer, right? It's very clearly, they are the customer, right? So I think that clarity is at least with us that we are serving the logistics arm and they are outsourcing because we are offering a value proposition better than perhaps any other vendor. And that vendor could be their own, self-operated in-house, captive logistics setup, right? So that at least that clarifies, at least from our side, there's no competition in that sense. And that keeps us very much, tight because we know these guys, unlike a regular customer, they know operations better than anybody else, right? So I think that's a good high bar on multiple aspects of cost or of customer experience that is kind of pushed, and we learn from that process.
Right.
But fundamentally, what's happening is if you take, let's say, an e-commerce company is shipping out 100 items and let's say 70 of them are going through their captive logistics arm and 30 is going through a 3PL. And of the 70, there might be, let's say, 20 that was earlier going through other vendors and 50 was done by themselves, right? Now that split is changing where they are actually going to give out more and more and operate by themselves directly less and less, right? So, and that is driven by multiple things. I think that's driven by variabilizing their cost, which outsourcing to players or ecosystem partners like us kind of enables them. And that's a massive advantage in times when there is a lot of variability in the overall environment.
Right.
It's also driven somewhat by regulatory constraints, etc. We find they are also seeing that the ecosystem is evolving much better than what it was earlier. So therefore, they are saying, okay, let us be the conveners, or can we orchestrate the ecosystem and the vendors rather than kind of necessarily doing it. In the first place, they got into doing it by themselves is because they found that the ecosystem was not adequate, right? So I think it all adds up for us to say that, look, this particular model of working will actually continue growing. There are a lot of tailwinds that this particular way of operating with them. And yes, there is a fine balance because you are talking to a very sophisticated customer who understands the in and outs of operations by themselves.
Got it. I want to take a bit of a detour, and I was looking at the questions which have been asked by the audience, and I think I can see that list growing. At the moment, I'm actually going to pick one for you, Pushkar, here.
Sure.
Which is that, and I'm just going to read it out actually literally, which is that new technologies and new applications of existing technologies have created new players in this industry.
Yep.
How do you think the incumbents, and I think some of you refer to the names of these incumbents as well, have either successfully or unsuccessfully responded to the challenge that is posed by startups like yourselves?
Understood. Fair question, Alok. I think to your earlier point of ERP in a refinery as well as tech at the core of the business, I think a lot of traditional companies, and hats off to them, have been able to be fairly agile to adapt most of these ERPs which are available out there. Right? I mean,
right.
They have gone ahead, bought probably ERPs which help them streamline few processes at their end.
Right.
I think fundamentally where there's a disconnect between the two of us is at the DNA, what you're trying to solve. We have technologists solving that problem for you, right? We're not people who are trying to automate a process, for instance, invoicing as a process, right? We are people who are trying to engage with a driver. Now, your approach to building technologies are very different. One is, buying a product which is available off the shelf, and another one is putting where your mouth is and, investing into technology by building it by your own insights. I think that's essentially the disconnect between a traditional player and a new age company, which I think because they do carry some baggage of their previous generation of what's been happening. They've automated a lot of processes, but at the core, it's still something which is driven through those processes, which is still a baggage. Right? For instance, a proof of delivery. There have been lots of digital tools which allow you to automate a proof of delivery, but can you fundamentally change a proof of delivery? Right? I mean, the fact that, yes, we've geotagged it, it has gone, then it is delivered, a customer has sent an OTP, eliminates the need of a POD. Right? I think that's the shift which people are trying to help. And I know it's a transition from both the buyer perspective as well as service providers perspective. But I think that's a fundamental shift which we are trying to bring into this industry.
Understand. I will take one more question from the audience before I come back to my long list of questions, which is still there.
Yes.
And this one is for Ashish, actually. And Ashish, you mentioned that you are invested in Kogoport also, which is in the freight forwarding industry. And I know that Raghu, Pushkar, and I'm assuming Nitin as well, probably do not see as much, but I may be wrong, Nitin, on that front. So Ashish, do you see any changes happening in the freight forwarding industry because of COVID as well?
I'm kind of thinking on the top of my head. I mean, I think if you look at the disruption probably has been higher in the EXIM business, just the complexity of supply chains, and there's just a lot more moving parts. Apart from that, I mean, I don't see anything very specific as to why COVID would have a disproportionate amount of impact on, the EXIM or the freight side of the industry versus the surface side. I mean, overall, I think where it gets down to is eventually, I mean, it's pretty simple business, right? I mean, your shippers are looking for, high level of consistency and meeting your SLAs and delivering the lowest cost, right? And they can compare and contrast both captive as well as any third parties they work with. Right. And on the other side, the truck owner, the vehicle owner, the asset owner is trying to basically, earn his living and probably make a few extra bucks, right? And have a process which is a little bit more, simpler versus the root canal of calling brokers and booking agents and trying to aggregate demand. So overall, I mean, companies that are able to deliver on both of these, and sometimes they don't go, hand in hand. So you have to optimize both sides of the chain. Would emerge as winners, but I don't see anything, specific happening on the freight side of the business because of COVID, which is not applicable to the rest of the industry.
Understand. But maybe just to push on this from my side also, Ashish, I think Raghu originally was talking about the fact that, yes, there is an impact, but we are getting back to 80% already. Of course, the journey from 80 to 100 may be hard. I would have imagined that when you look at the exports and imports, the impact on exports and imports are actually higher than actually the traditional movement within the country, partly just because of, I think, this anti-globalization sentiment that is just floating around. I don't know how much of that is real versus how much of that is really translating into volumes on the ground level. And therefore, even within your companies, do you see a higher impact on freight forwarding vis-a-vis the other spaces?
I need to kind of get deeper into it. I mean, so far I feel like, again, I mean, if you were to take, 3-4 months of, market dislocation out,
right.
While there is the, anti-globalization at a high level, right? But, I think, the geographies may change, but right. Clearly there are certain things you want to export, and clearly India wants to become a much bigger exporter. So I don't see that changing, right? On the import side, clearly there will be goal on self-sufficiency, and all of us are skeptical as to how much of that, vision can actually translate into reality. But let's argue some of it will. But these are again, things that you make here that also require a lot of components and other things. So I mean, I don't see a pervasive shift in the commerce side of it. The geographies may change. Maybe you are importing from Europe a little larger than what you would import from China. Maybe it's more components instead of finished goods and things like that.
Right. Got it. I'm going to come back to some of my questions, which I'm itching to ask, and I'll go back to Nitin. And Nitin, at the point when we were commenting on the margin structure in India versus others, I know you had some thoughts to say. One way in which I think you are unique within this panel, in addition to Ashish, of course, is the fact that you today have expanse beyond India as well. I believe that you have customers outside of this country as well, and therefore you have visibility into supply chains, not just in India, but outside India. I think it'll be useful, number one, to get a perspective on whether the regions of the world where you are deployed, are these largely emerging markets or these are developed markets as well? And if so, do you find any fundamental differences in the way supply chain works in those countries vis-a-vis it works in India?
Yeah. Most of my insight is from Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, and not North America, which is probably where most SaaS companies will have their insights from. So right. I want to call that out. Actually, in some sense, Alok, one of the early things that we decided to do was to look for geographies that are very similar to India.
Right.
That was an early sort of filter for us to pick the markets that we would go after, right? One of the things that I think is different about Pando compared to sort of actual logistics service providers is that we align, like you said, more with the industry or the demand side than with the vagaries on the supply side, right?
That's right.
Which is why I think that fundamentally, Raghu and Pushkar on one side and Pando on the other are fundamentally complementary, right? Because the consolidation that is required, and let's even think about it as data consolidation or knowledge consolidation, right? I think that is required both on the demand and the supply side, right? And we take care of that on the demand side, while I think both of them are trying to do this on the supply side. In that sense, I think the majority of channels of how go-to-market is done for these industries, let's say CPG in India vis-a-vis CPG in Southeast Asia, or CPG in India vis-a-vis CPG in Europe, I think the penetration of modern trade and e-commerce is larger. And fundamentally, because of that, the supply chains are organized slightly more differently, right? So I would actually think of that as a fairly a curve that every country will go through, and it will be fairly similar in terms of that evolution. And if logistics, everybody in the logistics space actually observes it from that standpoint of saying, how is my customer's customer evolving? And therefore, how will my customer evolve? And therefore, how will I evolve, right? That I think point of view would be interesting to see. And therefore, I think Europe has been interesting for us as an experimental ground. We raised some capital from there, and therefore had an early sense of how that particular market was evolving. I think when you look at the whole concept of direct to consumer that Pushkar was talking about, where we were saying, hey, can you deliver directly from your warehouse to your factory, from your warehouse to your distributor, or warehouse to your retailer as well, or warehouse potentially to the end consumer as well directly.
Right.
I think those concepts have sort of gotten an early start in some of those geographies. You see Unilever, by the way, having 4 or 5 different under different names. You wouldn't even recognize, you wouldn't even call it, Unilever, right? They have different names under which they have direct to consumer e-commerce portals, even in India, right? And there would be no Unilever branding anywhere, but they're actually, fronts that are owned by Unilever, fully
Right.
by Unilever. Right? Similarly, all CPG companies have that ecosystem in India as well, except that the maturity of that is a little ahead when it comes to some of these geographies. Right? The other fundamental difference that we also see, and actually before I come to that one, it's a fundamental similarity, is that this whole concept of aggregators, load boards, marketplaces, that trend that India is going through, interestingly, Europe and Southeast Asia are going through almost at par or at pace with India.
Very interesting.
And it's also and it's actually not ahead of the curve. It's almost at par. So you have Sender in Europe and a couple of other companies in Europe that are very, I would say in terms of scale, almost just ahead of Blackbuck, Revigo, Delivery, etc. So in the last mile space or the mid mile space, you have similar folks like Loadshare and Let's Transport. Southeast Asia has Cargo. The ex Uber guys started something called Cargo, which was very similar. So I think we're seeing that trend also happen across the globe.
Got it.
But the adoption of 3PLs and the penetration of 3PLs is actually getting questioned. We have a customer who's come to Pando as an inbound because they, for the last, and it's a CPG company, from about $100 million in revenue to about $1.3 billion in revenue when they scaled. They actually stuck to 2 transport partners that they outsourced all of warehousing and logistics to, right? And having scaled to this degree, now they actually wanted, looking at what was happening on the supply side, they wanted to actually partner with 4 or 5 different aggregators and marketplaces to essentially service that and move out of the 3PL model. So in some sense, people move from a outsourced model to a 3PL piece.
Yeah.
They were doing the opposite, right? And it's a fairly established brand, and they came to Pando because the organization did not know how to deal with a multi-vendor ecosystem, right? And Pando essentially converges that for them, right? While they can still maintain the multi-vendor supply side, they can still maintain it as a single face. So that is actually a significant difference in that different markets, the 3PL penetration is actually more significant, and that is determining the ambitions of entrepreneurs who are starting up in this space, right? If you're and which is what to me would be interesting to hear from Raghu and Pushkar, and it's a question I ask everybody in the logistics space is, ultimately, do you see yourselves as owning 100% of the pie of each of your customers, or would you see yourselves as owning a part of a large volume of customers, right? And I think that will fundamentally determine the direction in which the business and the ecosystem will evolve.
Thank you, Nitin. You're actually doing my job of asking questions also and giving answers. But since you did that, I'm actually going to request either Pushkar or Raghu to respond to it as well.
For us, it's very simple. We want to be serving more number of clients. We recognize we will not be doing a large share of them because it's going to be split across various different vendors like us. But we want to be serving more and figuring out a proposition by which we can aggregate across multiple of them and create value rather than kind of serving one and just being efficient at doing something and working in a in a way where client knows everything about our costs and they'll allow us a little bit of margin on top.
Got it. Go ahead, Pushkar.
Pushkar,
you're on mute.
Yes, I think we represent an efficient set of truckers, those who are willing to sweat more, those who are more efficient in transportation, so on and so forth. And that set of trucks, I think, is open to any set of clients who want to. I mean, if there's a client which sees a lot of value in getting all of those trucks, he's more than happy, plugging into our platform, getting probably 10,000 trucks from us. But the idea is to have the most efficient trucks. And I'm sure every client would want a more piece of having those efficient trucks.
Understand. I actually, when we were talking about supply chains outside the country, one of the countries which is always of a lot of interest to everyone is what is happening in China. And at least from whatever reports I've read, we have seen lots of large startups being created in this space. And Ashish, since you're an investor there as well, any similarities or contrast in the logistics structure that you can point to vis-a-vis China?
I mean, again, in terms of similarities, the problem statements was not very different. It's just, what they had 12, 15 years back in terms of fragmentation and e-commerce just picking up. So I think at a high level, I mean, what the 3PLs are trying to do here, I think that's the same thing that they're doing there. I think there are 3 or 4 very, big differences. So one is the industry structure. So when I talk to, my team in China as well as a few VCs out there, I mean, they tell me, well, 3PL logistics is no longer a startup game in China.
Yeah.
And I say, why? Because as you look at their industry structure, I mean, pretty much, at least in the e-commerce express, it is all dominated by whether it's Alibaba or JD. And, they have also made significant strategic investments. So, I mean, the top 4 or 5 companies will always have, a significant stake from one of those guys that becomes that they're part of the family. So if you look at largely the e-commerce space, we don't see too many opportunities for startups coming in. Now, there are some opportunities, in the last mile, space where, these are more regional kind of players. Who might be more catered to, SME shippers and others, right, versus the traditional e-commerce. So the opportunities there have largely been around, SaaS and technology players and, let's call it warehouse automation and things of that nature. So that's one difference. Obviously the scale is just humongous there. I mean, everything is, especially in this space, is 20x, 30x. The other big difference I see is a lot of these companies have gone public. So if you look at a lot of, the players are public, SF Express, etc., might be $30-35 billion of market cap. JD, which has their own captive arm, they are looking to go public at $30-40 billion valuation. So that's another big difference in terms of the maturity. The third is, I think, again, they have a lot of very large, incumbent old economy, and some of them are state-owned, some of them are, have been around for ages. So I feel like the industry structure is very different, public versus private, and obviously, given the maturity of the space, I think the margin structures, etc., are much better most of the public companies, almost all of them have make profits, and so that's one. The other thing is, I think clearly, given the head start they have and the infrastructure they have built,
Yeah.
I think they're far ahead. I mean, if you look at, let's say, for example, express deliveries. I mean, JD.com kind of claims that 90% of all orders that they receive directly, right, they're able to deliver within 24 hours. And I'm talking about, I'm talking about not only in Beijing and Shanghai. I mean, I'm talking about most of other pin codes, zip codes, or whatever they have. So I think those would be the big differences.
Got it. Got it. I do want to take one more question, very interesting question, actually. And it's an area that I actually quite like, and probably more directed towards Pushkar and Raghu, which is that, do you foresee that electric vehicles are likely to disrupt the 3PL industry anytime soon?
Yes, I think 3PL will change the cost structures, the incumbent cost structures for sure. I think all of us are in a play, where we are trying to kickstart the flywheel. Having said that, we are yet to find or come up with the right OEM who can promise a good, reliable product as in the electric vehicle space. So to answer your question, I think yes, we are at a tipping point, but I also think that there is a little more effort and work which needs to go on developing a right OEM based product.
Understand. Raghu, any different views on that?
I agree. I agree.
Got it. Got it. One other question I want to take from what the listeners have sent. Any of you can choose to answer, which is that, will we see a lot more M&A activity in the logistics space? And there is an if here, which is that if funding slows down for the next couple of years, which I guess many people are expecting, I guess, because of COVID, but would you agree, disagree with that statement?
So, I mean, let me start. I don't feel like there will be, very large level of consolidation or buyout through buyouts or M&A.
Right.
Now, there might be certain pockets where, a large player, well-funded player might be trying to fill, certain capability or IP holes here and there, or could be some regional players they want to kind of string together.
Right.
And the reason for that, I feel, is, I mean, what are you buying? So eventually, I mean, if you look at most of the startups in the 3PL space are two-way platforms. So the real core is eventually, yes, you have the network, but the real core is the proprietary, technology that you have built in, which is, kind of the secret sauce, right? So by consolidating, and this is not a winner takes all where you take one player out and improves the margin structure or something of that sort, right? So that doesn't work. And then even if you, I mean, everybody is working with every shipper, and nobody has any exclusive arrangements on the supply side as well,
Right.
so they can move very quickly. So eventually, I personally don't believe there will be some, kind of big ticket, M&A that will happen just because of funding slowdown. In fact, I would argue, if there is funding slowdown, even the big guys are trying to conserve capital. So, unless there is a very compelling reason in terms of certain geographies or certain tech or certain, kind of pick and drop type models, certain capabilities, etc., I don't see anything big happening in my mind.
Understood. I'm, in the interest of time, I'm being prompted that, look, we are reaching the end of our time. I do have one question which I want to ask. And I'm actually going to ask this to the three entrepreneurs. And maybe we'll begin with Nitin and then follow on with Pushkar and Raghu in that order, which is that, all of you have taken entrepreneurial journeys. And I know it's not an easy path. Many things have gone right. Many things would not have gone as you thought it might have. But if you look back in hindsight, is there anything that you would do differently in hindsight now that you know what you know?
It's been about 3 years since we have been at it with Pando, 3.5 years or so. Before that, for about 1.5 years, I took a punt with the supply side, which was an awful mistake. Multiple reasons, not least of which is that I think it was. I think it's a question of what DNA we were building with the business compared to what the founder market fit, right, was missing. And like most of us are, I continue to be extremely optimistic, and I knew a month in should have stopped then, but went on for a year and a half.
Got it. Got it. Pushkar, over to you.
I think there must be tons of mistakes which I've done, honestly. A lot of them were tactical in nature, but to answer your question and just to take a step back, when I started, I come from a fairly supply chain driven industry, and when I started, I did a very simple macro study, looked at the balance sheet of companies. क्या top line है Britannia इतना करती है, loss of sales 20%, you can add about 2,000 crores over there, and then inefficiency, if you save about 20-25%, you have another 2,000 crores there. So that's the math which I did, right? To your question of what I could do differently, right? I was approaching this problem with a play of optimization, and where you're trying to create efficiencies. I think it took us a little longer as a company to realize that there were a lot of baggages left by our earlier generations. Some of it would be working capital. I have a thesis on dynamic vehicle routing using heuristics, but the challenge was to clear a baggage of working capital, which is fairly large. It kind of scales you down, right? I think this should have been solved before. Having said that, we spent about 2 years today. Drivers can lend on our platform. We don't have to go on our balance sheet to kind of give them debt.
Right.
I think if I were to come and restart this industry, I would again choose the same industry. What I'm excited about is if you look at logistics, right? And this is no disrespect to anyone, but a lot of talented folks have not entered this industry. I mean, simple, right? I wouldn't have expected this conversation, a panelist of this stature, to probably come in 10 years ago in Indian logistics landscape. I think the fact that new age companies are able to attract talent such as Raghu from McKinsey to kind of deep dive into logistics, I think it's a fairly large industries where you can create a lot of efficiencies in and around. So I think I would have loved to kind of be aware of a lot of challenges such as working capital before, so that
Got it.
we wouldn't have done a lot of tactical mistakes, but I would have chosen the same industry, been passionate about same sort of truckers again.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Raghu, over to you.
Such a long list. I don't know where to start. But if I have to pick out the biggest one, I think for us, we started with a focus on the last mile and working with e-commerce guys, and we are 3.5 years old, and I think we got into the B2B logistics, as it's called, working with non-e-commerce companies. I think maybe a year and a half, a little bit more than that back, right? So if I had to rethink or if I had to retrace my steps and do something again, I would have probably done this earlier, right? Because I think there is a very large opportunity. It's not as mature as e-commerce logistics is. So I think I continue to be excited, and I wish I had done this a little bit earlier.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Guys, this was a very enjoyable panel for me. I clearly had the easier job of asking questions to all of you. And I also want to thank IVCA actually for organizing this. It gave me the opportunity to meet with Ashish properly, who I did not know prior to this panel very well. I, of course, knew Raghu, Pushkar, and Nitin, and I really respect all three of them immensely. I keep bugging them very often for their opinion on different things. And therefore, it was a great occasion for me to listen to all of them together. And I hope that that's the same way that the audience feels here as well. Clearly, if you look back at the, and sorry, I'm adding some of my opinion on top of what all of you have said. Personally, I still think that all said and done, we are still at the beginning of the journey as far as logistics is concerned from a tech-enabled perspective for this country. It's a massive industry. And if you add the revenues of all the quote unquote e-logistics players in this country, I still think that we make a tiny slice in this thing. So I think plenty of distance to be covered. I think that, yes, there will be some tightness because of COVID, whether it's about labor disruption, whether this is about oversupply that I think Raghu, you referred to, pricing competition, etc. All of that is going to happen for the short while. I still think that it is one of those industries that one can't do without. In many ways, if the roads of this country were to be the veins, you are the oxygen flowing in those veins. And I don't think the country can do without that piece. So, whether we are at 100% or 105 or 95 or whatever, I think that at least this is one industry which is here to stay. It is not a fad that will just pass by. All these statistics that we hear about the logistics as a percentage of the country's GDP, I don't think it has meaningfully changed yet, but I see that as an optimism as opposed to pessimism, because if in more mature economies you have 8 to 9% of their cost, or logistics is 8 to 9% of country's GDP, I think it basically makes me optimistic, because I think there is a lot of value to be created. Whether that happens because more and more of the supply side aggregation happens through technology, Pushkar, that I think you refer to, whether that happens because of the nature of supply chain changing itself in the industry, Nathan, that you were referring to, whether financing actually becomes more available, I think is a challenge that I think Pushkar you referred to as well. I think lots of those changes are yet to happen. I do also believe that, like Ashish said, the beauty of this industry is it is not a winner-take-all industry. And I think Raghu was referring to the fact that, look, competition, cooperation, I think sort of comes together in this kind of a business. Given the nature of this industry, at least I expect a ton of more value, ton of great companies to be created. We are fortunate to be part of one, but I'm hoping we'll be part of many more like Innovenis in this space. So at least I think that it's a sunrise industry, lot more to be done. And with that, I want to thank you all again to be part of this panel and to take out your time, and also thank the audience and for also asking the questions that they asked here.
Thank you so much, Alok sir. It was a pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much,
Thanks,
guys.
Alok.
I think thanks, Alok, Nitin, Pushkar, Ashish, Raghu. I think it was a very interesting panel, and we've got all of the audience hooked in. A lot of questions, and certainly I very strongly feel, and this comes from some of the feedback from investors only who've been in our past webinars, to invite more and more entrepreneurs. And it was certainly a good sort of an engagement and debate, and some of the highs and lows, some debates. Well, really thanks to you also, Alok, putting in all of this together. And to everyone, just thank you attendees also. So look forward to some of the really good webinars also coming up at IVCA. We're going to be discussing the future of work, attractiveness of the Indian opportunity in terms of the GPs, and also there's a panel on digitizing Bharat, where we have Sri Anil Agarwal, JSDPIT coming in. So a lot of exciting stuff coming at IVCA. Thank you again, everyone, and thanks, speakers. Cheers.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.